the twin revenue collapse in Venezuela. Today we discuss.
Welcome to Venezuela Insider, the only place in Venezuela for expats, digital nomads, entrepreneurs, investors, travelers, and related internationals. For more information, venezuelainsider.com.
If you are in economics and finance, you probably have heard the term twin deficit. That is push this particular concept for more of the free market economists and analysts, and it is regarded by most of the Keynesian economists and analysts, and I can too. Actually, I believe the twin deficit thing. It consists that if you both have a terrible fiscal deficit, so the government spends more that it earns via taxes and income revenue for the government, and also you have a negative trade deficit a particular country with the rest of the world, you both have a twin deficit that is going to bring a dire situation to, of course, the local economy. Now, most nations, most developed nations, they have, of course, a fiscal deficit. Basically, every European Union economy and also, the G7 nations have terrible fiscal deficits that they finance such deficits via debt, basically issuing debt, and of course that is basically bringing money from the future to today's economy. And that's why we have terrible debt to GDP ratios on basically most economies all over the world, but also on many important economies, the G7 nations and also the European Union nations. But if you see those economies are, look pretty much good compared, with both of these twin deficits. And of course, some of the most important economies don't have a trade deficit, actually have a trade surplus. It's not the case with the US that has a draconian fiscal deficit and also a trade deficit. But also most of these economies actually look better than they should look with this particular phenomena going on. Both most of them, all of them, that they have either a trade deficit or they have a fiscal deficit. Now, in Venezuela, particularly, doesn't work exactly like that. In Venezuela, we have a fiscal deficit that I have to take credit, I have to give credit to local authorities. They have been reducing the fiscal deficit year over year, still with a deficit. And actually, that's one of the reasons, that they created the hyperinflation, because in some important years, they cover the deficit not with debt, but actually printing money. And one of the reasons why Venezuela left the hyperinflation behind, we still have a high inflation that is meaningless because since 2019, we are de facto dollarized, but since 2021, the Venezuelan economy left officially the hyperinflation behind. And right now, we have, since the last 2 or 3 years, we have a triple-digit inflation that for the end of this year should be on the 2-digit inflation rate. However, Venezuela's economy on most years have actually a trade surplus. And the reason is, of course, oil. When we talk about the Venezuelan economy, we have to address the oil economy, regardless. Basically, what allows the Venezuelan economy, I'm talking the past 100 years, let's use an 100-year span, is that on most years, Venezuela always had a trade surplus compared to the rest of the world. That's a way in order to increase revenue, both for the government, but also for the economy overall. Trust me, on this particular regard, trickle-down economics does actually work. And of course, when you have a quote-unquote trade deficit, I'm talking historically in the past 100 years, you actually can have a deficit, a fiscal deficit, regarding, of course, the tax revenue, but it can be compensated. And most years, I'm talking on a 100-year span, it was compensated with a huge trade surplus, but also depends on the nuances on the worldwide oil economy. For instance, when I mentioned this example a bunch of times, is during the 70s, the Yom Kippur War. back then, remember Israel against their Middle Eastern allies, and Israel basically won that war easily. Middle Eastern nations were upset for that fact. And of course, they punish the Western allies of Israel and they declare an embargo of oil to Western economies. But back then, actually, Venezuela was one of the most important oil producers in the world and the only one that was actually not a Middle Eastern nation and also a member of OPEC. Still, Venezuela today is a member of OPEC. So Venezuela back then, with his position of a reliable, trustworthy provider of crude oil, but also the most important oil producer that was not a Middle Eastern producer. They basically took care of that, and back then, the prices of crude oil went sky high, and that created a huge trade surplus to the Venezuelan economy. And then also trickled down positively to the average citizen. The average citizen had a bunch of luxuries that still the older people they miss right now, but basically the lower middle class Venezuelan can travel to Margarita Island every single weekend, and the middle class Venezuelan can travel to Miami every single weekend as well. And of course, that got squandered by terrible policies by the government back then. That was during the Carlos Andrés Pérez administration. I mentioned this particular guy a couple of times. People here in Venezuela, either they love it or hate it. But, I mean, the guy is just like Thanos. He's inevitable. The Venezuelan government back then had the luxury to overspend, public spending and populism and terrible economic policies. And similar thing happened during these wars on the Middle East, yet again, on Iraq, especially, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan not as much, but on Iraq, and all of the turmoil that we had on the early 2000s, on the Middle East, especially on Iraq, but other parts, also the Libya situation we had back then. And still, at the moment, the government of Hugo Chavez, also they were able to overspend. They had a huge trade surplus and created a bunch of terrible economic policies as well that Maduro inherited when he became president. And also one of the reasons why we saw this terrible 80% GDP collapse. Now, the biggest issue regarding the collapse of the 80% GDP collapse is the twin revenue collapse that we had in Venezuela. First, of course, the price of crude oil collapsed from the late 2000s and early 2010s to the midst of the 2010s, and that, of course, affected the oil revenue and the trade surplus of the country. And the second thing is also the oil production in Venezuela fell drastically from the early 2000s to the midst of the 2010s. Back then, the president of PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, was Rafael Ramirez. This guy, I mentioned this a bunch of times, and pretty much he was the responsible of the destruction of the Venezuelan oil industry. And Venezuela went from producing around 3 million barrels of crude oil per day to actually the lowest point was during 2020, during COVID. Of course, you had COVID involved. And right now, Venezuela is producing between 800,000 and 900,000 barrels of crude oil per day. It's basically one of the lowest producers amongst the OPEC nations. But now the story is the trend. This is just the trend, not the level, is that this twin revenue of the Venezuelan oil industry is actually increasing. First, the prices of crude oil on the past couple of years have been slightly higher and significantly higher, actually, from a lowest point in 2020 during COVID. Remember, at some point, the futures market of the oil contracts, it reached negative $37. I mean, you get paid, technically, in theory, $37 for owning oil. But right now, actually, the price of crude oil worldwide has flirted on the $100 mark, thanks to many war conflicts that we have in the world, especially military operation in Ukraine since 2022. Of course, you have to consider that Russia is one of the most important oil producers in the world, around 10 million barrels of crude oil per day, and the Russian economy is tied to, of course, to the oil economy as well. And of course, the Russian economy being sanctioned, that creates more frictions and hence increases the price of worldwide crude oil. And now we have the situation, Middle East, the Gaza Strip, Israel, and also the Houthis in Yemen, basically on the Persian Arabic Gulf, as you want to call it, and that all of this turmoil and, of course, many Middle Eastern nations involved on this particular dichotomy that creates more frictions, that increases the speculation and the price of the crude oil worldwide. Now, the main question is Venezuela will be able on the next decade to capitalize this particular process of twin revenue regarding crude oil, both increasing oil production and also hoping for a high price of crude oil worldwide? Well, the answer is yes. Venezuela is actually slightly increasing the production of crude oil, slow but steady, of course, a long way to go, and also we have the sanctions issue, but still many Western companies are first, some of them are already placed in the country, doing their own thing and doing, the due diligence and some operations as well. And that trend is going to continue on the next decade, both Western multinationals and also probably Eastern multinationals, call it, companies from China, from Russia, and India. And for the other thing is regarding the prices of crude oil. They're going to be high on years to come. Well, with a bunch of hiccups, but I think the answer is yes as well. And here's why. And this is something that since COVID, I started doing more research in other sources of energy. I was on the side back then, I'm talking 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, I'm a petroleum engineer, but I'm not an expert on the other sources. I was not an expert on the other sources of energy. And historically, something that you see is that when you have new energy technology, energy supply from a new source, a more innovative source, it's not like the new source replaces the old one. The old one keeps on that particular trend, but the new one adds as well. Remember also, as the world evolves, also the demand for energy increases as well. And when you have new energy technology, could be solar, could be wind. Also, we are seeing the trend with electric cars, and also maybe the flirting with governments regarding nuclear and uranium and this particular of technology. What happens is that the new technology doesn't replace the old one. It just increases for the new demand, but the old technology keeps the same share. I was on the camp that oil will be useless and meaningless on the next few decades, but then I learned that it's not going to be the case. Oil is by far the most important commodity in the world. You can see this particular chart of market cap of each commodity, and oil is always relevant for the economy. The energy market is the economy. It's like the blood of the worldwide economy. Now, the other issue is inflation and monetary policy from the countries that manage hard currency. For instance, in the case of the US, that they have applying some irresponsible monetary policies, the Federal Reserve is printing more money, and the government, both Democrats and Republicans, by the way, they are increasing public spending and fiscal spending, and of course that creates inflation. That's how we're seeing right now in the United States and actually the rest of the world. But the European Union is doing something that is not different with the European Central Bank. They are printing euros like it's no tomorrow. That's why most European nations have terrible debt to GDP numbers. So that devalues, the value of the hard currencies. At the same token, the world is becoming more and more unstable. So that also increases the demand for commodities, but especially for oil. So you combine this particular geopolitical situation that increases speculation and also with conflicts, combined with terrible monetary policies from the countries that manage the hard currencies in the world, especially the dollar and the euro. So you can see in the future, we're still having higher and higher prices of crude oil for decades to come. And of course, that doesn't mean that the Venezuelan economy should, become a juggernaut within, of course, here in Latin America, but it does mean that the Venezuelan economy is going to have more revenue, more cash flow, and hence increase GDP, and hence increase, of course, the Venezuelan economic activity. Also combined with a mediocre governance for the politics, that, of course, that's the main issue. That's the suspicacity that most people, both Venezuelans and abroad, people have, is that the Venezuelan authorities can have a mediocre performance. And I think also that's going to be the case because the Venezuelan collapse was due thanks to self-inflicted wounds, of course, combined with this particular situation of the twin oil revenue collapse. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Well, after everything I say, well, I don't know, I'm no Nostradamus, but I can tell first, very bullish on the price of crude oil, very bullish of the Venezuelan oil production, and also I'm very bullish on the Venezuelan GDP, regarding that since it was due, the collapse of the Venezuelan economy was to self-inflicted wounds, combined with this particular twin income collapse of the oil revenue, with just a mediocre, the Venezuelan economy right now is around $100 billion, the size of the economy, and should be around maybe hovering 300 billion. So it's still a long way to go. And if we are going to reach those levels, well, honestly, I don't know, but we are going to get closer and closer and closer of that particular threshold every single year.
Thank you for watching Venezuela Insider. Please like, share, and subscribe. Follow us on social media. If you want to work with us, VenezuelaInsider.com. Thanks again and have a nice day.